All right, hello. Today I want to be doing a short history on England. Quick introduction. Um, Flag pictured in the background is the English flag. The flag over here is actually the flag of the United Kingdom. So England during ancient times. Even though I'm aware of its history, I'm not really an expert historian or whatever. But the oldest human remains were found dating to be around 41,000 BC. So that's evidence that we have of the oldest human being in England, not necessarily human habitation. The evidence of the oldest continual habitation of England was during the Cromwellian period between 13,000 and 11,000 BC. Um, what I am a little bit knowledgeable on is during the Iron Age, England became populated largely by Celtic peoples known as the Britons or the Celts in the beginning. The Celtic peoples were actually all over Europe, um, and there before the arrival even of the Indo-European family groups. So Celtic people are kind of special because they're the native Europeans, if you will. Everything else came after. And now on to Roman times. So the Roman invasion of Britain began with Julius Caesar's invasion, or invasions rather. But Julius Caesar didn't really, or the Romans during that time, like during the time of Caesar, didn't really establish any holdings in England. Like they tried to go there to conquer, but Caesar didn't take too many men. He wasn't really too successful, obviously, because he went underprepared because the British Celtic kingdoms were actually fairly developed. So then he fumbled it, and then the Romans were kind of done with Britain, especially now you don't think of Britain as scary. But Britain back then, by the Romans, was considered like a very mysterious land. The Romans were afraid of the Atlantic Ocean. They were afraid of big oceans in general. The Romans preferred to sail along the coasts. Um, in the beginning, for the longest times, Romans actually thought Britain just flat out didn't exist, or Romans would like um, act like it didn't, or that any news regarding Britain was just poppycock. Um, Eventually, around the reign of the Emperor Claudius, the Romans first launched a successful invasion, leading a well organized Roman army to defeat key Celtic tribes um, like the Catuvellauni. Well, um, part of my Latin there. The Romans gradually extended their control over England because around this time they were actually interested in holding the land. You had Hadrian who built his wall to keep out the pigs. You had uh, uh, Antonine, I think, who built a wall even higher up. But it was more or less like a little bit of a dick measuring contest, but using walls instead of dicks, because he built his wall higher than um, Hadrian built his wall, which was kind of useless because you know the Hadrian wall was already there and the land wasn't really of any particular value. It was just more costly. Um, but yeah, eventually they expanded their control over Britain until like pretty much the entirety of what we can consider now to be England was pretty much under Roman control. For instance, the English city called Bath. There used to be a Roman bathhouse there, and that's why the place is called Bath because that's where you would go to bathe. That's where the word bath and bathing comes from. Uh, I don't know if that's true. I literally just pulled that out of my ass, but we'll see if that's true or not. The Vikings are coming. So the Romans withdrew from Britain around 410 AD, and that's largely because their situation in Britain and in France, with the Germanic invasions of the Roman Empire, was becoming untenable. And they needed I think it was four Roman legions that were stationed in Britain. They needed those legions elsewhere because that was manpower and an expense that wasn't really getting them anything. Whereas uh, the French provinces of the Roman Empire were actually of some value to them. economically speaking. So after the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons kind of came knocking almost immediately onto British shores. So the Anglo-Saxons were, well, they were a people that were living in what is currently considered Denmark. Um, Pretty much, they were a group of like they were groups of Germanic tribes, like the Angles. That's where the word Anglo and English also comes from. These people probably spoke a type of Proto English. You have the Saxons and the Jutes. They're actually Germanic tribes hailing from what is currently Denmark. They also began moving towards the United Kingdom and specifically England en masse, because at that time there was a little bit of a winter. Um, Not a Game of Thrones style winter, but like the winters were becoming more severe and the climate was getting colder for one reason or another. And during that time, there were a lot of lands in the north that actually became less and less fertile, simply due to winter becoming much, much stronger there. So, like you have shorter summers, meaning you can grow less plants. You have longer winters, meaning it's harder to survive. And that drove these people south. That's why I had actually also the Huns and various Asian steppe peoples trying to migrate south during that time as well. If I'm not mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. So initially, they arrived trying to supposedly help the um, I don't know if they were called Britons again or if they were the Roman Britons, but they initially came as mercenaries to help defend against other invaders. But they pretty soon turned on their host when they realized they were the only guys left with swords on the island, pretty much. And then at some point, these guys established like a couple of petty kingdoms, which I think is secretly one of the reasons George R. R. Martin wrote Game of Thrones. It's pretty much kind of indirectly built on this sort of area because you have multiple kingdoms within the borders of what's currently pretty much the British Isles, specifically England and Scotland. Um, at some point, though, the native Britons were driven westward. So they were the sort of native population that was still there after the Roman invasion, the original Britons that, the Celts that were living there, kind of. They ended up with like a tiny kingdom there on the west coast of England, laying the foundation. Oh wait, no, not them. The Anglo-Saxons by that time were forming the foundations of what would become the Kingdom of England, because all these various kingdoms were vying for, like, in quotation marks, the English crowns. Because they were all aware, like, we're all on the same island. This is this is the British, the British island, the island of the Britons, and we're conquering it. We're vying for the Britannic throne. I'm not sure if it was called Britain at the time or England or if that had some other word. I'm not a languagist. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So from the 7th century onwards to the Norman conquest, England was pretty much dominated by these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, so like Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. They often vied for control over England. So whichever nation had the biggest army or the most money or whatever, was kind of the most powerful for a while. Wessex eventually emerged as the most powerful, particularly under kings like Alfred the Great, who defended against further Viking invasions. They were still going on at the time. Around the 10th century, when the climate had stabilized a little bit, the last invasions were also happening by the Danes, I think. And then eventually the climate also improved there for people to be able to really live there again. King Athelstan had united England pretty much under one rule. However, the Viking invasions continues, leading to the establishment of the Danelaw in the north and the east, where the Norse customs prevailed. And in 1016, the Danish king Knut briefly ruled England, but by 1042, the Anglo-Saxon line was restored with Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor, I don't think he had any successors. So by the time that he died, he didn't have an heir. So there was a succession crisis. the local nobility. Um, Fuck, what was the dude's name? I forgot the dude's name, but anyway, William the Conqueror pretty much invaded England because there was this other guy that was proclaimed King of England by the Anglo-Saxon nobility, pretty much. And William of Normandy was a Norman ruler. He was ruling from Caen, which is in France. And then pretty much he moved in with his Anglo-Saxon army. He fought the dude that was there. He won, and then he became king. Because he claimed that Edward the Confessor had named him his successor in the event that he would die without an heir, which is what happened. So the Norman conquest and the beginning of Britain. The Norman invasion of Britain, led by William the Conqueror, began in 1066, following the death of the English king Edward the Confessor. Oh yeah, Harold Godwinson, that was the dude's name. So yeah, he pretty much, fought that dude over the English crown, and then he won. And then he claimed the throne. And then, he was like, oh yeah, no, he totally said I was supposed to be the king or whatever, but, might makes right, I guess. So on October 14th, 1066, he met William's forces met Harold's at the Battle of Hastings. Find the Battle of Hastings, me personally, very boring. If you've ever played Medieval 2, it's the most boring, well, maybe not the most boring, but it's one of the most boring medieval battles probably ever fought. It's a good standard example of medieval warfare during the time, though. So if you're interested in medieval warfare, you can kind of research that battle. It's pretty much the basics of how things were done back then. So eventually, he was actually crowned the King of England. Sorry, no editing, so the sneeze is gonna stay in. So eventually, the Norman conquest, brought significant changes to England, mainly the introduction of feudalism. Feudalism is a system whereby you establish fiefs. So you have the king; he's the boss of the country, and the country is made up of all these fiefs. And a fief can be like a fucking mill. It can be a small castle. It can be a bunch of land. It can be a city. It can be various things. But pretty much, you have noble lords who get a fief from the king. So pretty much, if you're a noble, if you're someone of proper standing and birth, if you're a noble, you ask the king for pretty much, land to rule, and then he just gives it to you, and then you rule it in his name essentially, and then you're, let's say, the boss of your little town, and when you're the feudal lord of a little town, the people pay their taxes and owe their abeyance to you, and then pretty much you're sitting on the land, and you're sitting on everything your peasants produce for you, and then you hand over a percentage of that in taxes to the king back in London, to the crown. And you keep a small portion for yourself. Also, the king doesn't really have a standing army per se. Obviously, he does have his own household guard in one form or another. That's probably permanent. But generally, when kings went to war in the medieval era, they would call upon their feudal lords, which is, their vassals. They would call their banners, and all the people that he gave land to individually answer the call, and depending on their state. So if you have, let's say, a huge city, you might pull up with, let's say, 1,000 heavily armored knights. And if you're the lord of a little village, you might pull up with 5 archers or something. And then you have all these people from all over a kingdom or all over a nation. People from a bunch of towns, cities, villages, whatever. Even back then you had them. And they pull up with their stuff, and then that's your army. It was all very ad hoc. There was no standardization back then. People were wearing the insignia of their house, over their armor, as a tunic. This is also where noble insignia come from and all that. So you could know who was who, because nobles had a tendency to not actually try to murder each other. They would just, bang their swords a couple of times, and whoever loses their sword first gets made captive and ransomed. That was really popular at the time, ransoming. Good way of making money. Also, the blending of the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman customs were actually laying the foundation for the English state. They were already kind of built. It's just that the concept of an England at that point was developed because William the Conqueror essentially proclaimed himself the King of England, thereby sort of starting the whole story of England, pretty much. So the Magna Carta, a little bit of a history because I know a little bit about this. Before the Magna Carta was signed, you have this guy whose nickname is John Lackland. The reason why it was called Lackland, his brother, I believe, was King Richard the Lionheart, known for his crusade to Jerusalem. So his brother was actually kind of an amazing military commander, leader, if you will. So he answered the Pope's call to crusade and pretty much ransomed his entire kingdom to the church in exchange for money and funds, so he could keep having fun in his little crusade. Initially, I think his crusade went fairly well, but at some point, obviously, he had to return to England after fighting a couple of battles successfully, which Richard the Lionheart did. But then on the way back to England, for some reason, he decided to stop somewhere in France to take some fucking shit castle or whatever, because he's Richard the Lionheart of England, this guy's brother. And then he dies, and then this guy becomes king. But for the longest time, this guy's brother was just chilling in Jerusalem. He's like having fun crusading, and this guy's here in England, like kind of trying to rule in his brother's stead, but not allowed because, the church was given all the power. And they were already mocking him, calling him King Lackland because, his brother's in Jerusalem. He's next in line to be king, and he doesn't have any land, pretty much. And he was also considered a very weak ruler. And then all the nobles get together and they're like, yo, dude, we got this paper, right? And this paper says that we can do whatever we want, and you have to listen to us. And he wasn't really feeling it. He signed it, but he went back on the deal at some point. I think he started recruiting some Danish mercenaries or whatever and tried to fight them. At some point, there was a couple of battles, and then these guys eventually forced him to reaffirm his position for the Magna Carta, and they took pretty much all of his power from him. The English king became kind of a figurehead. And this also means that if you think about it, England is one of the first countries to have a little bit of a constitution, because it's entirely based on this, which pretty much says that all these rich dudes, know better what's good for England than the king does. Which was actually a fairly new concept, that people could know better how to rule their nation than kings could. It started here. England leading up to the Age of Sail. So in the 15th and 16th centuries, England was pretty much thriving and growing, mainly focused on its own internal politics. They were kind of trying to be important on the international stage, but Britain was kind of an economical backwater at the time. However, they were really developing their sailing, and they were already doing various naval voyages, sponsored by Queen Elizabeth, pictured in the background there, the first, not the second. And they kind of thrived. And then during her reign, I believe, is when they started doing the colonies in the Americas, and England kind of became a more important nation because they were really starting to get interested in their boats. In the 17th century, actually pretty interesting, you had this king, I think, called Charles the First, right? And pretty much Charles the First disliked the Magna Carta and felt like he should be allowed to do whatever he wants. And, he probably kind of should be allowed to do whatever he wants because he's the king. It's his prerogative. It's his nation. He should be able to do whatever he wants. And then this guy was like, you can't do whatever you want. You or your grandpappy made this deal with us rich people. You got to do what we say. And then they murdered him for it, pretty much. I forgot about the court case, but it was quite interesting. You should study it. Pretty sure there's more interesting videos on there. And then this guy, Oliver Cromwell, decided I'll become the regent And then he pretty much appointed himself regent, in place of the king. So essentially, he's saying, "I'm not the king. I'm the guy ruling the kingdom in place of the king, and I'm waiting for the king to come back." Um, I don't know if anyone ever came back from execution, but I'm pretty sure um, he's not going to come back. Anyway, after Cromwell died, the monarchy was restored in 1660 with Charles II. The latter part of the century saw the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where James II was overthrown, and William III and Mary II took the throne under the conditions that established a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary sovereignty, shaping the future of British governance. So, what that meant essentially was the line of the royal family um, became kind of like it is now, where it's like, okay, the king and the queen are the king and the queen, but they don't really have any power. Like, all the power is with the parliament, you know, and we're simply the ones in charge, you know. Parliament makes all the decisions. You just always give your stamp of approval. You're the king, like we swear, let's say in air quotes, obedience to you, and you're like the figurehead of the country, but you're not like in charge. Obviously, they do wield some influence, being the British sovereign, but it's more symbolic power than actual authority. So Britannia ruled away. So during the era of William III, England was already well on its way to become a naval superpower. It colonized the Americas. It expanded its empire to pretty much all coasts of the globe. It was starting to do slave trading, expanding towards Asia. Um, a lot of people say, like, oh, like the United Kingdom was a drug dealer empire or whatever. Well, in the beginning, opium wasn't really what was making them all their money. In the beginning, it was tea. And not just tea, things like spices, like things that are easy to get a hold of now. Back then were super expensive. Having spicy food was crazy expensive because the spices were crazy expensive, because mainly they were also meant for export. And the British were also, because they were big on naval things, they were big on trade in general, simply because they had put a lot of effort into ship technology, during that time. If you look at the pictures of sailboats pictured in the background here, they're kind of massive. You can see one parked next to a building, and it's almost equally high as a 3-story building. So these ships are enormous. They're like engineering marvels of their time. And like sailing ships are slow in comparison to a modern ship. True. But you have to compare them to ships that came before them. And things that came before these bigger sailing ships were smaller things like these sloops. And even though this sloop is fairly fast, I think with a good wind, it can probably go faster than this big ship. But the thing is you have to understand is you're not carrying a lot of cargo with these types of ships. This is actually a line ship, so this really wouldn't carry cargo. An Indiaman would carry cargo, and it would have far less cannons and way more cargo space. But the overall ship design is fairly similar. And these Indiamen, because they were pretty huge ships, like they're almost as big as buildings. And look at this rigging. Like they have huge sails. Like the sails are easily bigger than the building. So the wind that's blowing against that was able to push these ships with a good wind to be only a little bit slower than these ships. And the main advantage in these smaller ships is maneuverability. But these things weren't really meant to be maneuverable. They're cargo haulers. When you use one of these ships, when you sail somewhere, you sail into a preset harbor. Like you would probably sail into a harbor that's already there, and then unload certain wares to sell to whatever people are willing to buy what you got, and then you buy goods and then you go back. That's why the East India Trading Company was a trading company. It was doing trade. Like people often do it a lot of injustice because they were also doing a lot of exploitative things. But fundamentally, it started as a trading company. So the 18th century was like a very interesting time for England. It really became England as we know it today. With the Hanoverian monarchy and the Act of Union in 1707, England fused with Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. During this period, um, the early stages of the British Empire were taking form, with a lot of territorial expansion in areas like India, South America, Australia, um, and Asia in general. England was becoming really the big dog on the global stage. All of the same, during this time as well, the foundation of the Industrial Revolution was laid, where things like steam engines and steam trains were being developed. You start to get earlier stages of steel manufacturing, where it really becomes manufacturing, not really steel artisanry, let's say, like actual manufacturing. Machinery was kind of becoming common. Technologies and things like rifle development, gunpowder, and all that, like it was all becoming much better. Um, Modern day cannons, like not to the extent that we know them now with modern artillery, but cannons were becoming quite sophisticated. Um, all these things were happening. It was a pretty interesting time, definitely. A lot of medicine started being developed in this time because I believe during this time they noticed if a cow or if people get pox, right, like or the plague or whatever, they would often die from sickness. But they noticed peasants, especially ones with cows, especially would not get the pox or not die from the pox. I forgot which one it was. I think it was chicken pox. But anyway, so then this doctor tried to do an experiment. He like took a little bit of nastiness from a boil and he inoculated a child with it. I believe he used a scalpel. Like he got a little bit of grossness from like a lump or a cyst or whatever from like a cow that has the chicken pox, and then he put it in a human, and then the human got sick but recovered, and then they found out that immunity was a thing pretty much. Like modern medicine was invented in this time, and a lot of people shit on modern medicine. I like shitting on it too because they're like ever since then they failed to get a cure for cancer, and we're still waiting for it. So hurry up, doctors. Not looking good for you, but they were doing a lot of smart stuff. Like I think at some point during this time, no, it was later. They figured out washing your hands was a good idea, especially with something like alcohol. I think it may have been after or during the Napoleonic Wars as well that the Red Cross was invented. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. So the Napoleonic era was during the 19th century. Pretty much it was a conflict, the Napoleonic era, between England and France mainly, where England had the most powerful navy of the world. And France, under Napoleon, quickly developed, let's say, the strongest army and the strongest military institutions. Because Napoleon was a very smart military organizer and thinker. So Napoleon had a formidable land army. The British had a formidable navy. Napoleon could never reach the British, and the British could never hope to defeat Napoleon on European soil. Eventually, Napoleon thought it might be a good idea to invade Russia, and then he got absolutely slaughtered with his Grand Armée. And then he had to limp back to Paris, at which point he pretty much pissed off every European monarchy and a pretty much powerful noble that wasn't French. So he had the whole of Europe slowly turn against him. And then Napoleon was really good at defeating all of these European countries kind of one by one in like a 1v1 battle. But all of a sudden, it became sort of a free-for-all of like Napoleon versus everyone else. And that backfired on him. Because Napoleon was good, again, but you can be as good as you want. You're not going to win against everyone. It's like in an actual fight, in a 1v1 situation, let's say your odds are kind of 50-50, let's say, if you're being fair. And then if you do a 1 versus 7, like forget about it, bro. You're going to get fucking murdered. It's just the way it is. The 19th century, so that's the era before the 20th century. Um, it's pretty much a time where the Industrial Revolution was really starting to really get going, where you had Britain becoming like very industrialized, cities swelling, new developments in agriculture, and just building things, the rise of factories. You have modern sort of steam trains making their appearance, steamships. Britain was pretty much no longer bound by um, pretty much this was the start of the modern world. Pretty much, um, the British were doing the scramble for Africa during this time as well. Oh wait, yeah, steam trains, cool. Oh wait, um, wait, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, around this time is when they had, I think, fully captured India. Pretty much, they were in charge of most of Asia, either outright or by doing their little great game with Russia. The opium trade with China was fully going on. Um, they had a ton of colonies in Africa. The Americans were independent, but Australia and Canada were English. The Spanish Empire has sort of lost South America already, and the English are not trying to get involved because they can just do trade with them because they essentially own the sea. Yeah, steam trains. I love steam trains. They were a revolutionary force in England, pioneered in the 19th century. They transformed transportation and industry. The Iron Horse rapidly expanded the nation's reach, obviously, connecting cities, transporting goods, fueling economic growth, um, pretty much turning England into a like bustling industrial landscape. You know, um, steam trains really changed everything for the better. Um, Eventually, of course, they would become outdated by diesel and electric trains, but still, their legacy endures. And some of the strongest trains still to this day are steam trains, because steam trains actually have more torque than modern trains, which is why some of them are actually still kept in use. Not a lot of people know that. Oh wait, scramble for Africa. So during this era, like also the 19th century, still. England started expanding its holdings in Africa, like also mainly due to the advent of the railway. So, with each railway line laid, England would be able to get more and more resources from Africa because you're actually able to collect the resources and ship them back to England. Um, this is also when like it was really discovered that Africa has a shit heap of resources. The English already had resources to do things at the time, but Africa just has a ton of various resources. For instance, England itself has, I think, a lot of coal and iron, but England isn't really as iron rich as it is, let's say, gold rich. And coal and iron is nice for making steam trains and boats, but it's not really going to make you very wealthy. And Africa has like a lot of gold, oil, diamonds, um, varieties of other metals, copper, tin. You think of it, you name it, it's got it pretty much, which is why Africa is very interesting to the British. Thanks to the advent as well of malaria medication in the 19th century, Europeans could actually live in Africa. Also true. Before the advent of malaria medication, like very few Europeans would live in Africa, and the Europeans that would live there would often get sick and things like this. And if they recovered, like they could kind of stay in Africa, and if they wouldn't recover, they would probably die because there's no or there wasn't any medicine again until the advent of malaria medication. England is often criticized for its resource extraction to fuel its ever-growing industry, which is a little bit unfair because most of the resource extraction to fuel its ever-growing industry came from Britain. The main reason why they wanted African resources, again, is so they would have more resources to trade. Um, England in this time was particularly interested in things like making more iron and steel because that's what they needed mainly for the expansion and the maintenance of their empire. because gold is like a valuable metal, but if you think about it in practical terms, it's got no military value. So if you're a military power, you value steel and iron over gold. Gold is nice to look at, and like it can be a proceeds, let's say, coin of military endeavors, but it's not worth anything. You can't use it. So the World Wars. So England during the World Wars. During the First World War, all the royal families of all the major powers, so England, Germany, and Russia, all were grandchildren of Queen Victoria of England, actually. So the King of England and Germany and Russia were all nephews. And they would write letters to each other during the war, like, "Oh, please, cousin, I hope you stop this terrible war, and let me win." And then they would reply, like, "My cousin, my beloved cousin, the King of Germany, even though I would love to surrender to you out of love for childhood or whatever, I'm afraid I simply cannot abide by this. I have to do what is in the interest of my country. Please, cousin, I implore you to instead surrender to me, the King of England." And whilst they're going back and forth, they're having their generals murder millions of their young men, pretty much over nothing, over the same 10 kilometers or so in Paris, which is why I chose this picture as a slide for not near Paris, but in the Verdun region, like where you had a lot of the no man's land. This is what it looked like. 4 years of permanent war. It really scarred the land. This land was so polluted. Oh my God. England's role in World War One was pretty pivotal. It was one of the major powers participating. It's one of the primary reasons the Allies at the time won. Obviously, at the end of the war, the Americans started joining in. They were already kind of helping the British, but the British leveraged their vast empire and the resources of their vast empire, and also the demography of their conquered population. So think of like the things like Indian soldiers fighting in World War One, and I mean Indian soldiers as in from India, not Indian soldiers like. Egyptians, a lot of Arabs fought during the First World War. Tons of people, man, died. It was pretty bad. I forgot how many died, but I think it was like at least 30 million people died. And then at the end of the First World War, you also had the first case of the modern flu, which was at the time called the Spanish flu because they blamed the Spanish for it because it started there, but it didn't really come from Spain. And it got worse because it was during the end of World War One. You had a lot of people very close together because there's a giant war going on, meaning everyone got sick everywhere all at once. If you want to find out how exactly the war went, you can look up a different video. I'm just doing it very quickly, kind of off the top of my head. A lot of terrible things were done during World War War, like a lot of chemical weapons being used. And this actually caused at the end of the war, nations to form sort of the Geneva Conventions, which even during World War II, even Nazi Germany abided by the Geneva Conventions, and I think so did Soviet Russia, just not Japan. So the Geneva Conventions pretty much have rules for war, and the Geneva Conventions say if I participate in the Geneva Conventions, if I sign them, I say I'm going to follow those rules during wartime, and so do all other signatory nations. So if you and another nation are both signatories to the Geneva Conventions, you're essentially saying you're going to abide by the rules. The Japanese actually never signed them, I think, which is the reason why the Japanese were much more brutal during World War II. Also, the Japanese were kind of doing a lot of stuff during World War One. Everyone pretends World War II started for Japan in 1941, a day that lived in infamy, but that's just the Americans. For regular people, World War II started in the European theater with the rise of Adolf Hitler, effectively in 1939, with the Anschluss after the invasion of Poland in 1940. But World War II, or rather World War I, started for Japan pretty much during World War I, where Japan actually allied with the English and was allowed to fight a variety of nations. Think of nations like Japan was allowed to fight China and the German holdings in Asia. Um, so Japan was already well underway to start in World War II, already in World War One. Except because it's an Asian power, all European countries like, oh, you know, only white people can do proper warfare. There's no way the Japanese will ever figure out how to make a good mustard. And then all the English go, hey. And then, they're giving black people and Indians guns, and they know damn well they know how to use them, especially against them. And then for some reason, the English act all surprised when, former colonial nations actually start developing nations to have proper armies, like, let's say, the Japanese and the Chinese. And then the English go, oh my, the natives, oh, they have developed rifles. Oh my. Legitimate World War One British impersonation, probably. All right, on to World War Two. World War Two was really different from World War One from the English. They still had an army. They still had the Commonwealth and all that. India was still with them. But during World War Two, there was already a lot of nationalist movement going on in all the various nations. So think South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, India, a lot of their colonies in Africa. And kind of the same thing was going on for their allies. So during World War II, again, the English leveraged their vast empire to sort of fight against Germany. The problem was during World War II, Germany became a lot better at fighting ground wars and was actually able to kind of steamroll Europe with a mix of luck and good military leadership, I would argue. And the British were kind of really the only one to stand against them, mainly because the Germans, even though they became good at fighting, let's say, ground wars, there was no way they were going to be able to build up a sufficient naval force to fight Britain alone, let alone both the United Kingdom and the United States. So during World War II, eventually, the German offensives in the Soviet Union kind of ground to a halt by the Soviet Union's resolve and, of course, Marshall Plan aid, because the Soviets at the time actually weren't fairly developed, and they just came out of the Russian Civil War, where the Bolsheviks became in charge of Russia after World War One. So because the Bolshevik Revolution had recently happened, Soviet industry was kind of in tatters. And what a lot of people don't know is the Soviets were actually using a lot of American military equipment during World War II. Nonetheless, without the help of the Soviet Union and then being able to retreat so far into Russia to where the Germans could no longer sustain their offensives logistically anymore, the Western Allies were sort of able to fund and produce sufficient military equipment to organize a sufficient invasion of Europe. And they had a plan. They had a plan Germany, where at all costs the Allies wanted to defeat Germany first, and then they would all work together to defeat Japan. And this strategy, I think, is actually kind of smart, because the European theater was sort of a little bit more dynamic in a way, almost in the Pacific Ocean, and that has to do with size. The Pacific Ocean is huge in comparison to Europe. And largely, there's no islands. Like, there's no land there. So you can't do land battles. It's all navies and naval logistics and all that. And they're way more expensive than ground invasions. So it was really imperative for the Allies to win in Europe first. So then they really had all the proper resources they could leverage to defeat Japan. But they did fight both nations simultaneously. It's just that America and the United Kingdom gave Germany most priority. So at first, Germany got pushed out of Africa. Then it got invaded in Italy. Then obviously you have the D-Day landing and the Soviets marching all the way up to the Oder River until eventually you have the German battles, I think, for the Jurgen Force, like near the end, the Battle of Aachen, and like the capture of the Rhineland and the liberation of the Netherlands is sort of the end of the Western campaign. Because at that moment, I think the Soviets had already captured Berlin and the Americans were just like driving there because Nazi Germany had crumbled. But yeah, Britain really had a huge impact on the course of World War II and really leveraged everything they had in terms of military power as an empire. Like World War II was really exhaustive for the British, and it kind of caused a certain war wariness where um, the idea first started coming about, where maybe all these endless wars with our fellow humans isn't really such a good idea. A lot of other nations would kind of follow in a similar footsteps, besides from maybe America. So the slow death of the empire. So the British Empire, once a colossal titan, eventually began to slow an inexorable decline after World War II. The immense cost of the conflict, coupled with the rise of nationalist movement in the colonies, sort of eroded Britain's dominance. And then India's independence in 1947 really marked the end of the British Empire as it was before, where it would sort of lose colonies, and if nations didn't want to become like a part of the British Commonwealth, where like the English monarchy is still like, let's say, you know, the government figurehead, but like essentially all nations kind of became independent with their own government that only pay lip service to the British monarchy. But some current nations, I think, that still pay lip service to the English monarchy is obviously England and Scotland, Northern England, also Australia and New Zealand, I think, and Canada. They're all part of the British Commonwealth currently, I think. So England does still have a lot of international pull. Yeah, that was kind of my video for today. I didn't really want to delve too much in depth on this subject. I do find English history quite interesting. I do know a little bit of general information about it, but I'm in no way an expert, but I'm not English. So this is sort of my take on it and the knowledge I have. All right, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good one. Please like and subscribe. Maybe leave a comment or some shit.